Now, I want to tell you about a man named Thomas Grant. And I want to start at the end, or near enough to it, because that's where the truth lives clearest. April the 1st, 1884. Thomas stood in the parlor of his ranch house, turning a simple gold band between calloused fingers. His hands had roped steers, mended corrals, pulled calves in blizzards. But right now, they wouldn't stay still. He tried the words again. Anna, I'm offering you. He stopped, rubbed his face with both hands, started over, stopped again. The ring caught lamplight and threw a small spark against the wall. Thomas closed his fist around it and pressed it against his chest, breathing slow, the way you breathe when you're trying to keep your heart from running ahead of your mind. But I need to take you back 6 weeks to a Valentine's night when everything changed with a single knock. February 14th, bitter cold had settled over the valley like a punishment. Wind carved through the timber walls, and frost painted the windows in patterns that looked like old lace. Thomas sat alone at his long dining table, a table built for 12, occupied by one. It had been that way for 7 years, ever since he'd built this place with his own hands, and the stubborn belief that a family would come to fill it. The family never came. 2 courtships had withered, one to distance, one to his own silence. Thomas was a man who built things, but couldn't find the words to ask someone to share them. Beef stew cooling in a bowl, fire crackling low, silence heavy as snowfall. Then the knock came. Not a polite knock, a desperate one, weak fists against heavy oak. The sound of someone using the last of everything they had just to make noise. Thomas crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled the door open. The wind hit him first. Then he saw her, a woman skeletal, frost clinging to her shawl, dark circles carved beneath hollow eyes. She clutched a bundle against her chest, a baby, 6 months old, maybe less. The child wasn't crying, too weak to cry. The woman's knees buckled. Thomas caught them both before they hit the frozen ground. Easy now, he said, lifting her like she weighed nothing because she nearly did. Come on, you're inside now. You're safe. He carried them to the fire, wrapped blankets around her shoulders, heated broth with his own hands while barking at his foreman. Get Doc Harlan, ride fast, don't stop for nothing. The doctor came by lantern, examined the woman and the baby with grave, quiet hands. When he finished, he pulled Thomas aside. Another hour out there, Doc Harlan said, removing his spectacles, and you'd be digging 2 graves come morning. Thomas stood by the window long after the doctor left. The snow was falling heavier now. His eyes drifted to the fence line a section of split rail had broken months ago, leaving a gap wide enough for a person to stumble through. That was how she'd reached his door. He stared at that broken fence, made no move to fix it. Anna Reed woke in pieces. First came warmth, a foreign sensation after weeks of cold that had soaked into her marrow like poison. Then the softness beneath her, sheets that smelled of cedar and soap. Then sound of fire popping somewhere close, wind against glass. And beneath it all, the tiny rhythm of her son breathing. Her hands found him before her eyes opened. He was there tucked against her side, warm, fed, sleeping. She gripped him so tightly her knuckles went white. Fingers curled into his blanket the way roots grip soil, even unconscious. She had never let go. Anna forced her eyes open. A bedroom she didn't recognize. Log walls, a patchwork quilt, morning light slanting through clean curtains, a porcelain basin on the nightstand, a chair pulled close to the bed, as though someone had been sitting vigil through the night. Panic climbed her throat. She tried to sit. The room tilted and swam. The door opened quietly. A tall man entered carrying a tray broth, bread, a cup of water. He had broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. He moved carefully. The way you move around something fragile, you don't want to spook. Morning, ma'am, he said. His voice was low, unhurried. Name's Thomas Grant. This is my ranch. You're safe here. Both of you. Anna studied his face. She'd learned to read men in the months since William died, their motives, their calculations, the cost hidden behind every kindness. She searched Thomas Grant's face for pity, found none, searched for expectation, found none of that either. Just steady, patient concern, the kind that asks nothing back. How long? Her voice cracked like dry timber. 2 days. Doc Harlan came. Said you and the little one just needed warmth and food and rest. She looked at her son. His cheeks held color she hadn't seen in weeks. Someone had fed him, changed him, cared for him while she lay useless and broken. I have to. She tried to stand, her legs folded like wet paper. Thomas caught her arm, held her steady, didn't comment. Just waited until she found her balance, then stepped back and gave her space. Ain't no rush, ma'am. Not in this house. He left the broth and closed the door softly behind him. Anna sat in the silence, her baby warm against her side, the walls solid and close around them. She allowed herself one thought, the first in months she hadn't crushed before it could draw breath. Safe. 3 days after Valentine's night, Anna sat in the kitchen with her spine straight and her chin lifted. She held a cup of broth Thomas had brought. Her son slept in a makeshift cradle one of the ranch hands had fashioned from a feed crate lined with wool blankets. Thomas sat across from her. He didn't push, didn't pry, just waited, the way a man waits for weather to clear, patient, unhurried, willing to sit with silence until it was ready to break. Anna told her story. My husband, William, died 3 months ago. Fever took him in 11 days. Her voice held steady through the first sentence. On the second, her hand tightened around the cup until the knuckles blanched. We'd married against my family's wishes. William was a clerk. They said I'd married beneath my station. She paused, swallowed once, hard the only crack in her composure, and she sealed it immediately. When he died, I wrote to my parents. They replied that I had made my choice. Thomas's jaw set like iron, He said nothing, but his hands flattened against the table, pressing down, as if holding something back. I had no income, no position. I took what savings remained and traveled west, looking for work, a governess post, a teaching position, anything respectable. She looked at her sleeping son. The money ran out in Colorado. I kept walking. Think about that for a moment. An educated woman from a good family, walking hundreds of miles through winter with a baby in her arms because the people who should have caught her decided she wasn't worth catching. You can stay, Thomas said quietly. Long as you need, till you're well and situated. Anna's jaw tightened. Pride warring with need, a battle she'd been losing for months, and refused to surrender. She nodded once. No tears. She would not give tears to this moment. Thomas stood. At the doorway he paused. Anna was feeding her son, her thin fingers steady, her face fierce with tenderness. She whispered something to the baby too quiet for Thomas to hear, too gentle for this hard world she'd been walking through. He moved to the window. The broken fence was there, gap wide open against the snow. He could send a hand to mend it by afternoon. He didn't. 1 week after that Valentine's night knock, Anna was on her feet. I can cook, clean, anything, she told Thomas, and her voice carried the edge of someone who would rather collapse again than sit idle in another person's home. I won't take charity, Mr. Grant. I'll earn my keep, or I'll leave. Thomas opened his mouth to protest. Something in her eyes, iron wrapped in exhaustion, stopped him cold. He nodded. What happened next changed the ranch house more than any storm or season ever had. Anna attacked the kitchen first. She scrubbed surfaces that hadn't seen proper attention since Thomas's housekeeper quit 2 years back. She reorganized the pantry flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, all labeled in her precise, educated handwriting. She mended curtains that had hung crooked so long Thomas had stopped seeing them. She moved through the house with a ferocity that had nothing to do with cleaning and everything to do with proving to Thomas, to herself, to the God who'd taken her husband and her family and her savings, that she was not a woman who sat down and waited to be saved. Then she cooked biscuits that rose like clouds, stew that made his foreman, Hank, sit down and stare at his bowl in something close to religious wonder. Cornbread with honey butter that old Pete declared was finer than anything this side of the Mississippi. And I've been to both sides. Coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, but smooth somehow, a trick Thomas never did figure out. The ranch hands, 5 weathered men who communicated mainly through grunts and tobacco spit, fell completely, hopelessly, under the spell of Anna's 6-month-old son. It started with old Pete, who carved a tiny wooden horse from a scrap of pine and left it beside the cradle without a word. Then, Hank fashioned a rattle from a tin can and dried beans. Young Charlie, barely 19, homesick and trying to hide it, took to holding the baby during supper, bouncing him on his knee with a gentleness that surprised everyone, including himself. Anna watched these rough, calloused men gentle themselves for her child. She watched them argue in fierce whispers over whose turn it was to hold him. She watched Pete, a man who'd reportedly once stared down a grizzly and didn't blink, make the most ridiculous faces God ever put on a grown man, just to earn a toothless grin. And Anna laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the careful, measured sound she'd been trained to produce in her mother's parlor. A real laugh surprised out of her, bright and sudden as spring water breaking through ice. That evening, she set the table for supper. Not just for Thomas. For everyone, tin plates and mismatched forks and a centerpiece of dried sage in a mason jar. The ranch hands filed in, scrubbed and sheepish, hats in their hands. Anna placed Thomas's plate at the head of the table, without being asked. He noticed. He said nothing. But the way he looked at that plate, at where she'd placed it, and what that placing meant, said everything he couldn't. 3 weeks in, and Thomas Grant was in trouble. He knew it the way a rancher knows weather, not by reading signs, but by feeling the shift in his own bones. Something fundamental had moved inside him, and it wasn't going back to where it was. Here's what Thomas never said out loud, not to Hank, not to Doc Harlan, not to the fence posts he sometimes talked to when the loneliness pressed too close. He'd started waking before dawn, not from habit, from want. He'd lie in the dark, listening for the sound of Anna singing to her baby in the kitchen. She always sang the same hymn, low, more breath than melody. Her voice wasn't beautiful in the way parlor singers were beautiful. It was true. And Thomas, who'd spent 7 years listening to nothing but wind and cattle and his own breathing, would lie still and let that sound fill every empty room inside him. During the days, he found himself watching her. Not staring, just aware, the way you're aware of a river, even when you're not looking at it directly. She read to the baby from his bookshelves. Shakespeare, poetry, held the child on her hip and spoke in complete sentences, as though a 6-month-old deserved proper grammar and she intended to provide it. She thanked each ranch hand by name every meal, every kindness, every carved toy. She never complained. Not once. Not about her thin dresses or her cracked hands or the weight she still hadn't fully regained. She worked as if work itself were a form of prayer. And Thomas understood because he worked the same way. Once, in the middle of folding laundry, Anna paused. Her hands went still over one of the baby's blankets. Her eyes drifted somewhere far away, somewhere Thomas couldn't follow. William. She was remembering William. The moment lasted 3 breaths, maybe 4. Then she blinked, pressed the blanket to her face, inhaled once, and resumed folding. She didn't know Thomas had seen it. He never mentioned it. But it told him something important Anna Reed had loved before. Deeply. And she carried that love with her still, not as a wound, but as proof that her heart worked. The ranch house had changed around Thomas so gradually, he almost missed it. The room smelled of bread now. The windows were clean enough to see the mountains. Laughter lived at the supper table, where silence used to sit. A cradle by the fire, curtains that hung straight, small hands reaching for carved horses. He began to dread the day she'd be well enough to leave. Caught himself calculating recovery times and hating himself for hoping the answer was longer. One evening, Thomas rode the fence line at sunset. He reached the broken section, the gap she'd stumbled through on Valentine's night, still unmended. 6 hands on this ranch who could fix it in an afternoon. Thomas sat on his horse, looking at that gap. The last light caught the fallen rails, painting them gold. He made no move to dismount, no move to repair. He didn't want to close it. 5 weeks after Valentine's night, Anna found stationery in Thomas's study. Fine paper, cream-colored, with a watermark she recognized from another lifetime. She sat with a pen for 20 minutes before writing a single word. Dear Mother and Father, she wrote carefully. Told them about William's death again, they knew. But she needed them to hear it in her hand. Her ink. Her grief made permanent on paper. Told them about the baby growing strong now, smiling at everything, grabbing at the world with both fists as if he intended to hold on no matter what. She mentioned Thomas only as a kind stranger. She did not beg, she did not accuse. She sealed the letter, knowing it would go unanswered, the way you know rain is coming before the first drop falls. That evening, Anna sat on the front porch with the sealed letter in her lap. The night air had softened. Early spring was pushing through frost, retreating, the earth exhaling after months of holding its breath. Stars scattered thick as spilled flour across a sky so wide it made her chest ache. Inside, Thomas's low voice carried through the open window, talking with Hank about the spring roundup, cattle prices, fence repairs, though not she'd noticed, and wondered about, and said nothing about the broken section near the eastern line. Have you ever been so afraid of hoping that you'd rather leave than risk being told you don't belong, because the truth had been building inside Anna for weeks, quiet and relentless as spring thaw, and she couldn't hold it back any longer. She didn't want to leave, not the ranch that smelled of bread she'd baked, not the rough-handed cowboys who fought like children over holding her son, not the man whose boots she heard on the porch each evening, the man who always paused at the door before entering, as if gathering himself for the sight of her. But what could she offer Thomas Grant? She was a penniless widow with a baby and a family name that meant nothing west of Philadelphia. She owned one dress, one pair of mended shoes, and more grief than any man should be asked to share. Anna pulled her shawl tight against the spring chill, looked down at her sleeping son in the crook of her arm. "We can't stay, sweetheart," she whispered. "We can't." Her voice broke on the second can't, and the letter sat in her lap, already answered by silence. While inside the house, a good man talked about cattle prices and didn't mention the fence he refused to mend. Late March, Thomas rode to town alone. He told Hank he needed supplies. What he needed was a ring. The jeweler in Clearwater was a German named Kellerman who'd been fitting wedding bands on ranchers' fingers for 20 years. Thomas stood at the glass case, hat in his hands, and pointed to a simple gold band. Nothing ornate, nothing that tried to impress. Anna wasn't a woman who needed impressing. She was clear and honest as running water, and the ring should match. Plain band, Kellerman said, lifting it from the velvet. He held it to the light, turning it slowly. In my experience, the man who picks the simple ring, he knows what matters. The ones who pick the diamonds, they're still guessing. Thomas pocketed the ring without answering, mounted his horse, rode toward home. But the doubt came riding with him, keeping pace, mile after mile. Was this love, or was it something dressed in love's clothing, rescue, loneliness, the selfish need to fill a table built for 12? Would Anna say yes because she wanted to, or because winter had stripped her of every option? But the one standing in front of her, was he offering a partnership or building a cage with a kind man's hands? The questions gnawed at him all the way back. Thomas pulled his collar against the March wind and let them bite. At the ranch, he found Hank mending tack by the barn. The foreman was a lean, weathered man of 50 who said little and meant all of it. "Hank, I need to ask you something." Hank looked up from the leather. His hands went still. He waited. "That woman in my house," Thomas's voice was rough. "You think she stays because she's got no place else, or because she wants to be here?" Hank set down his awl, gave the question the consideration he gave everything. Slow, thorough, honest. "Boss, I've watched that woman work harder than any hand on this ranch. She scrubs your floors like she's proven something to God Almighty." He picked up the awl again. "She ain't staying because she's weak. She's staying because this is where she belongs. And if you can't see that, you're the only soul on this ranch who can't." Thomas walked the fence line alone, found the broken section, stood there in the last light of March with the gold band warm in his coat pocket. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't ride into danger. It's stand still and say what's in his heart. He looked at the gap. He'd thought about mending it 100 times. Hadn't once reached for a hammer. Because what came through that opening on Valentine's night had given him back his life, and you don't board up the door that saved you. He turned toward the house, through the kitchen window. Lamplight glowed amber. Anna's silhouette moved behind the glass. Then her voice, that hymn again, low and true, carried on the evening air like something sacred that didn't need a church to be holy. Thomas pressed his hand over the ring. The doubt was gone. In its place was something quieter and infinitely stronger. He knew. "Remember that ring from the very first moment I told you about? The one Thomas turned between his trembling fingers in the parlor. This is where it finds its home, April the 1st, 1884. 6 weeks to the day since a Valentine's Night knock changed everything. The morning broke mild and soft, spring asserting itself, winter retreating like a spent argument. The sky stretched high and pale, scrubbed clean by a night wind that had carried the last of the cold somewhere else. Thomas found Anna in the kitchen after breakfast. She was drying dishes while the baby played with Pete's carved horse on a blanket by the fire, batting at it, gumming its wooden mane, perfectly content with his small corner of the world. "Walk with me," Thomas asked. His voice held steady, his hands, buried in his coat pockets. "Did not." Anna studied his face. Whatever she read there made her set down the dish towel without a question. She lifted her son to her hip. They walked out together into the spring morning. Thomas led her east, past the barn where Hank looked up from his work, caught Thomas's eye, and gave a single nod. Past the corral where the horses stood warm in the early sun, to the fence line, to the gap. The broken rails lay where they'd fallen months ago, half buried now in new grass. Wildflowers, early ones, purple and white, had pushed through the dirt around the posts, growing thick in the space where nothing had been mended and everything had been allowed to come through. They stood in the place where Anna had stumbled onto his land, starving, half dead, with nothing but a baby and the last stubborn embers of her courage burning low. Thomas turned to face her, took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff edge into open sky. Anna, I'm offering you security, not charity. He pulled the ring from his pocket. The gold caught the morning light. Marry me. Let me be the father your son needs. Let me protect you both. And the words landed between them. Anna stared at the ring, then at Thomas, then at the gap in the fence, the place where she'd crawled through ice and darkness. Certain she was dying, certain the world had no more doors left to open. Tears came. She didn't fight them. Why? The word was barely a sound. Why would you choose us? We're nobody. We have nothing. Thomas reached for her hand. His grip was rough and warm and absolutely sure. You're a mother who walked hundreds of miles to save her child. His voice cracked. He let it crack. Let her see what it cost him to say this, because the truth should cost something, or it isn't worth much. He paused, searching for a word that lived somewhere beyond his usual vocabulary, somewhere past what plain-spoken ranchers say. He found it. That's not nobody, Anna. That's heroism. He swallowed hard. Marry me. For a long moment, the world held its breath, the wind stilled. The baby went quiet on Anna's hip, watching his mother's face with wide, serious eyes. Then spring rain began to fall gentle, soft, the kind that coaxes seeds from sleeping soil. It touched their faces like a benediction. The baby reached for the raindrops, laughing suddenly. And the sound broke the stillness, wide open. Yes, Anna said. Thomas slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been waiting there all along. The rain fell around them, warm for April, and Anna laughed through her tears, a sound Thomas would remember for the rest of his life, and the baby grabbed Thomas's collar with both small fists and held on tight, as if he understood, as if he'd chosen to. They walked back through the gap in the fence together. Anna paused at the broken rails, looked at them, reached down, and touched the nearest post gently, the way you touch something holy. Thomas took her hand. Neither one mentioned mending it. They married the following Sunday, a quiet ceremony in the ranch house parlor, Doc Harlan as witness, Hank standing solemn as a church deacon in his only clean shirt, and the ranch hands crowded in the doorway because they wouldn't miss this for all the cattle in Montana. Pete held the baby. Young Charlie wiped his eyes with his sleeve and muttered something about dust that fooled nobody. Anna wore a blue dress she'd sewn from fabric Thomas had bought in town. Simple and beautiful, the way truth is beautiful when it doesn't need decoration. Her son wore a new cotton gown, and when the preacher spoke the final words, the baby clapped his hands once, twice as if he understood exactly what had happened, and approved entirely. Now, I could end the story there. Most stories would, but the best part of this one isn't the wedding. It's what grew from it. Years pass the way years do on a working ranch, measured in seasons and roundups and Sunday suppers that filled the long table Thomas had built for 12. Anna's son grew the way boys grow in open country, sunburned and strong, quick with horses, quicker with books. He had his mother's education and his father's quiet way of doing right, without needing anyone to notice. He called Thomas Papa, not because anyone told him to, not because he was corrected or coached or sat down for a conversation about what names to use. He called Thomas Papa because Thomas was the man who taught him to ride, who read to him by lamplight, who carried him on broad shoulders through spring pastures, who sat beside his bed during fevers and told him stories about a brave woman who walked through a snowstorm to save her son. Thomas was the man who showed up every single day, steady, patient, present, and love like that doesn't need a lesson. Children know. They always know. He never learned any different, because there was nothing different to learn. The broken fence was never mended, Over the years, it became a family landmark, the spot where Anna stumbled through and Thomas's real life began. Wildflowers grew thick around those fallen rails every spring, purple and white, more beautiful each year. The ranch hands called it Anna's Gate, and every new hire heard the story within his first week on the job, every Valentine's night, without fail. Thomas set an extra place at the supper table. It was tradition now the whole family gathered, the kitchen warm with bread and laughter and reaching hands. And Thomas would tell the story the way he always told it, his voice low and steady, his wife's hand resting on his arm. "Your mother knocked on my door with nothing but you and her courage," he'd say, looking across the table at his son, "and she gave me everything." The boy would smile. Later, the young man would smile, having heard this story 100 times, never once tired of it. Because some stories don't wear thin with telling. They deepen. They grow roots. They become the ground you stand on. Anna learned that accepting help isn't weakness, it's the bravest kind of trust, the kind that requires you to believe you're worth saving. And Thomas, he discovered that the strongest love doesn't come from rescuing someone. It grows quietly, surely, from watching courage under impossible circumstances, from witnessing a woman rebuild herself with bare hands and unbreakable will, and choosing to stand beside her, not above, beside. That's the truth of it. Sometimes the door you open for a stranger is really the door to your own life. And sometimes a broken fence isn't something that needs fixing. Sometimes it's the most important gate you'll ever build, the one you leave open on purpose, so that whatever miracle is walking through the snow can find its way home. Valentine's Night. Snow falling soft against the windows, lamplight pouring from every room of the ranch house, warm and gold and steady, and out past the barn, past the corral where the horses stand quiet. There's a gap in the eastern fence line where the wildflowers grow thickest. It's still open. It will always be open. And the door, Thomas Grant's door, the one a starving woman knocked on when she had nothing left but her child and her courage, that door has never been locked again. Not once. Not ever. The end.